the factors judges would be taking into account when women in Sindisiwe Manqele's position are being sentenced?
Well, firstly, they would look at, in terms of her claims to self-defense, they would look at what were the immediate circumstances in which the killing happened. Was there a threat to her life? And did she respond with force that was proportional to the threat? So obviously if somebody's walking away from you and you then stab them in the back, the courts would not say that you acted in self-defense. So that's what the courts would have looked at in terms of assessing whether or not she qualified for self-defense. Because obviously if that had succeeded, she would have been acquitted entirely. But because she was found guilty, what they would then look at are things like, was the crime premeditated? Because in murder, if it is premeditated, there's a sentence of 25 years or life imprisonment. And they look at mitigating circumstances like your age, your likelihood of reoffending, the danger you pose to society, whether you're a candidate for rehabilitation, and whether or not this is your first offence. They should, and they do in some instances also look at the history of abuse. But that's, from what the cases I've observed, can be a little bit erratic, and I think judges don't always necessarily know how to interpret and understand a history of abuse.
Let's look at that. I mean, the judge made a statement in his ruling. Manqele needed to be prevented from killing her next partner, he said. Is that assumption of serial killing, so to speak, necessarily relevant in this context?
No, and I think it's a very unwarranted assumption to draw unless the psychologist had said she poses a danger to others. And if she did, then she would have had a heavier sentence. So I think that was a throwaway remark that suggested he didn't really understand domestic violence. And usually in situations of domestic violence, it's that particular person who is the threat to the woman, not others. I mean, she's able to tell who is dangerous towards her and who is not. But I mean, I think in situations of abuse, it is important that you try and assist somebody with what they've gone through, especially after a homicide, because it is very difficult to come to terms with.
Manqele survived a number of abusive relationships. She also testified that her relationship with Flabber was fairly abusive in itself. What happens over a period of time to women who go from one abusive relationship to another?
Well, I think those are cases you need to look at really very carefully, because what that might point to is somebody who feels so low about themselves that the best they think they deserve in life is abuse. And I think it's very important that if one is seeing that pattern, that you work with someone that they are able to expect more for themselves and are also able, where they are being relentlessly mistreated, is to be able to say, I'm not going to take this, I'm worth more, and to be able to move on. That doesn't seem to have happened in this particular instance, and it's a great shame that she was in a position where that the best she hoped for herself was abuse and mistreatment. And I think under those circumstances, it can make it quite risky to be in a relationship like that, because you're obviously dealing with accumulated anger, frustration and rage that comes not only from that relationship but from previous relationships that you may have been in as well. And so it may be that when you're faced with it again, it might act as a catalyst for all that those previous experiences you've had, and so your reaction could be disproportionate. One would need to have a closer look at her case to say whether or not this happened, but that can be a possible consequence.
You know, it's commonly accepted she is emotionally fragile. It's understood that she seemingly tried to commit suicide after the killing. She now goes into a prison system that will offer her rehabilitation.
We hope.
Well, how effective will that be?
You know, just from some experience I've had when working with women in prison who've killed their partners, there's actually very little good emotional help for them. There are probably no more than about 25 psychologists in South Africa for a prison population of some 180,000. So it means you don't necessarily get the help you get. There are also very few social workers as well. So, you know, you've got there can be a waiting list of months before you end up seeing the psychologist. And sometimes, you know, even when women are suicide risks, it may take a while before they're assessed by a psychiatrist and given the necessary medication. Not only that, if the psychiatrist is not around, sometimes there are lapses and drops in their medication and it's interrupted, which is also not good where you are depressed. So I think, you know, if we're looking at prison and its way of dealing with women who are abused, it's not very effective. In fact, a couple of women I've worked with have said to me that being in prison was no different from being in an abusive relationship. All that had changed was who was now controlling their lives and telling them what to do and when they could talk to people and what they could eat. So in a sense, it doesn't really ever help them to get over the abuse because they're still in the same set of structures where they are powerless and are not given options to do things differently.
I just want to ask you one last question about reintegration, particularly after a long period. Were Sindisiwe Manqele to serve out the sentence of 12 years and then be reintegrated into society with no family members virtually left, how easy is it for women in that situation?
It's going to be very difficult in her situation because a criterion for being released is that you have somewhere to go. And if you don't have anywhere to go and you don't have a family member, you can stay in prison. So I think it would be very important that one helps her create those supportive structures for when she comes out. And I think for women like her and others in the position, the challenge is also to society. Because I must say, with some of the women I've worked with, it was an enormous struggle when they came out because people did not want to accept them and consider them dangerous and violent.